Good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking a moment to pause and reflect with me on a couple of truths that I think are going to help you and make a difference as we continue to consider the idea of providence in our lives. I want to begin with a verse from the book of Esther. It's a story from the Old Testament, and some of you will be familiar with it and some of you won't, and that's okay. But it's powerful, and it talks about timing, and it talks about courage, and it talks about God being at work, as sometimes He is, quietly, behind the scenes. And the verse says this, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Do you know that phrase, "for such a time as this," has actually worked its way not just into Christian culture, but into modern culture across the world over the last couple of hundred years. That phrase has turned up over and over again. But the verse points us to an enduring truth, that God places people in the right place at the right time. I believe He's placed you in the right place at the right time. So let's set the scene. Let's consider Esther's story. Here's a little bit of context. She was a young Jewish woman. She was living in a foreign land. In fact, dangerously living in a foreign land. It was a legacy piece. She didn't come from wealth. She didn't come from influence. And through a series of unexpected events, she was chosen to become queen to a really powerful king. A position that she never sought and she never imagined for herself. Now, at the time, her new role may have felt overwhelming. It was risky. It was overwhelming. It would have felt that way. She was living with a bit of a hidden identity as well. She was surrounded by people with far more power than she had and much more influence than she had. But then a crisis emerged. A law was put in place that threatened the lives of Esther's people. It threatened the lives of the Jewish people living in the area at the time. Now, she had access to the king. She was married to him. But approaching him without being invited could actually cost her her life. That's actually what happened in those days. If you approached the king with a request, you weren't invited, even if you were married to him, he could get angry and just say, "Off with her head." It was at this moment that her cousin, a man named Mordecai, spoke these words to her for such a time as this, reminding her that perhaps she had been placed exactly where she was by God for a purpose. Not a chance, but for a purpose. For such a time as this. Esther had a choice. She could remain silent, or she could show some courage and step forward. And through her willingness to act, God worked powerfully in her life and saved thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives. What is really striking about Esther's story is that God's name, the name of God, is never actually mentioned in that whole book of the Bible. His name isn't mentioned. But when we look at the whole book and we look at the whole story, despite the fact His name isn't mentioned, we can see His hand at work. We can see Him designing and Him placing and Him positioning people in particular spots to make sure that people were protected and His plans came to pass. His providence is everywhere, in the timing, in the positioning, in the people involved. Esther couldn't see the full picture. She didn't know that her life was going to take that turn, and she didn't know that that position was going to be, and that opportunity and that chance for action was going to be presented to her. She had no idea. Only later did it become clear that God had been preparing her for that very moment. And do you know what? I think that's actually how God works in our lives as well. You may not understand why you're in a particular season, in a particular place, in a particular situation. But with time, we often look back and we can see that God was at work. he was engineering, he was creating, he was designing something. I want to share an example, a story I know that took place between a couple of teachers. Several years ago, I was working at a different school, and I know that this one particular teacher had been experiencing a really difficult season in their life. They'd had also a really hard day. Lessons had gone wrong, things just hadn't happened, resources hadn't worked out, technology hadn't worked out for them, things had just gone really poorly across the whole day. And on reflection, talking with them afterwards, they were talking about this idea that situations and circumstances, just one after the other, after the other, after the other, in this workday seemed to be stacking up against them. And because of their context of what the really difficult things that were going on in their personal life, they were becoming more and more anxious, feeling like the world was against them. And they were at this breaking point. And I know from my circumstance, and I know from just the fact that this is what life does, for some of you, right now, life might feel like that. Now, as they were packing up at the end of the day, another staff member was walking down the hallway. And they were just on their way to the car. They'd finished packing up for the day, life had gone a little bit better for them, and they were just on the way to where they needed to go to next. They'd walk past the room, but then they just kind of felt, I might stop and say hi. And so they turned around and walked into the room and said something along the lines, now I can't remember it exactly, but they said something along the lines of, look, I don't know why, but I felt I needed to check in with you. I want to let you know I think you're doing an amazing job. I love the way you work with your students. I love the way you deliver what you deliver. You're amazing, and I want to say thank you. They had a brief conversation, and then that person continued on their way. It was just a moment of encouragement. It lasted less than 2 minutes, but it was exactly at the right time. For the person struggling, it brought encouragement, reassurance, and renewed strength. Neither person planned it, but I actually think God did. One person was in the right place, at the right time, with the right words. And that's actually providence. So, like Esther, we may not always feel significant, prepared, confident, but somehow God works through ordinary people in ordinary moments. Each day we cross paths with each other, with staff, with fellow students, with families. Everybody's carrying unseen burdens. Everybody's got stuff going on. A kind word, a moment of patience, a word of encouragement, a moment to listen, a response shaped by grace and care. These moments may seem small, but I actually think in God's hands, they make an incredible difference. So as you reflect today, I want to ask you a couple of questions. Number one, who has God used to encourage you? Think about that. Who has spoken hope into your life? And number two, how might you be that person in somebody's life today? How could you be that word of encouragement, that kindness, that grace, that care? Who might God have placed in your path today for such a time as this? God bless you. I'll see you around.